CW here. I got another video working on here. This one is a video reply to Boomstick's Revenge. He did my video, my challenge, the squirrel rifles, and he came back with his own, which was cheap scopes on squirrel rifles, cheap scopes on 22s, and it's a great idea. So he wants to know what your favorite cheap scope is that you like to put on whatever you want to put it on. So I'm going to continue along with the squirrel rifle 22 rimfire, because that's where I like to put cheap optics. I don't everybody's definition of cheap is different, right? To me, cheap is relative. Cheap is going to be, you've got cheap cars, you've got cheap gum, chewing gum, you've got cheap, everything. Ammunition, cheap rifles, cheap scopes. So the price range we're talking about for me to be cheap is going to be under $100, even in today's world. So if you can get something for 100, let's stretch it to 125. That's going to be a cheap optic to me. Don't really remember using anything cheaper. There is some cheaper stuff around, but I don't remember using it myself. And what I'm going to say my favorite is Simmons rifle scopes. And what you're looking at here is a Bushnell and a Tasco. But I've got a couple of Simmons over here. But I'm going to lump them together because they're really in the same ballpark. Yeah, they're totally different manufacturers, but the class of scope I'm talking about is a high magnification, high volume range variable, 6 to 18, 8 to 32, 6 to 24. You can get down as far as a 2 to 10, but that's probably on the low end. This happens to be a 2.5 to 10. This one here I think is a 6 to 18, and I've got a couple of 4 to 12s over here. And I really enjoy over scoping. Okay, too much scope power for the caliber that it is. Over scoping rimfire rifles. And here's a couple of classic examples. This here is my Savage, because everybody's dragging out their Savages, so I drag out my Savage. And I don't even remember what model this is. This is a Mark II. That's it, Savage Mark II. And it's a 22 long rifle only. Why they don't want you shooting shorts and longs in it, I'm not sure, but there it is. See if you can see it on there. See if I can possibly zoom in without making you crazy. This mount is not really friendly for this, but let's see. Okay, here we go. Savage Mark II, caliber 22 long rifle, ONLY. And what it's got on it is a old school Tasco, probably 10 years old. It's been on a bunch of rifles. See, it's all scuffed up. There's the Tasco name. Does it say where it's made? It's printed on the bottom there, but I can't read it. It's under the scope ring, so I can't read it. But it's a little bit newer because it's a one-piece body tube. You can see it's one-piece tube. No, it's not. Two-piece tube. That front is a piece screwed in. 2.5 up to 10 power. This one just has a duplex reticle, standard 30-30 reticle, but it does have stand-up turrets, which are kind of nice. I wouldn't crank on them a lot, but it's nice not needing a tool. When you're sighting in, you can just use that. And this one is mounted up really exactly how I like it, just as low as you can go, and you can see that's almost kissing but not touching the barrel. Just as low as you can go. And it's got an adjustable objective variable for parallax, which is really important, especially with rimfires, because most centerfire scopes are set parallax free for like 175 yards. So when you're shooting 125, 150, you're close enough that it's not going to make a big difference. And if you're shooting past 175 generally, your parallax is going to be okay for a longer range. You're not going to have a problem. But if you're consistently shooting less than 100 yards, 50 yards, 35 yards, that parallax is going to be a big factor in your accuracy. And it's going to be a big negative to accuracy with rimfires because they're generally shot so up close. So one thing all my rimfire scopes have to have is parallax set for rimfires, which is going to be about 75 yards. Or have adjustable parallax, whether that be at the objective end or a side focus. Either one will do a trick. Either one will let you set the parallax for 0 at the range you're shooting at. And it's really, really important. What's parallax? Parallax is the difference between your reticle and your target. And you can tell if that's in place, if that's something that your scope has, by setting up your rifle, your pistol, your scope on a rest. So it's rigid on a bench, rigid at the range. And you get a target set out there at whatever yardage you're shooting at. Doesn't have to be a set 100 yards, but can be whatever yardage you're shooting at. Set the scope up, don't touch it. Make sure you can see your target. Look through the scope. Now, move your head around so that you can still see your target. You can still see what you're shooting at, but you're looking at the sides, the top, the bottom, the middle. Go back and forth with your eyeball, and you will see that reticle move and shift its point of aim. So you line it up on the center, and then you move your head around. And that reticle, that crosshair, will move. It'll shift. It'll go up and down, left and right, depending on where your head is inside that. It's called the eyebox, the shaft of light that comes out of the objective side of the scope that lets you see through the scope. When you get outside the eyebox, the scope blacks out and you can't see through it. The better the scope, the bigger the eyebox. That's why you look at some of the cheaper scopes and you can't see through them unless you're perfectly lined up on the stock, or the rifle, the scope is mounted too low or too high for you. You have to move around, hunt around to find it. That's a smaller eyebox. Not necessarily a sign of a cheaper scope, but it is a sign of a smaller shaft of light coming out of the back of that scope. Generally, you want to see about 6 millimeters, 5 millimeters minimum, because that's what your eyeball is generally going to be when you're outside looking. You're going to want to have about that much. You want 3 to 5 millimeter on your eyeball. So 5 millimeters, 6 millimeters is what you want to have out of your scope to give you enough leeway that you're not going to have your scope blacking out when you don't want it to. And more is not necessarily a bad thing. In some situations it can be, but for the sake of what we're talking about here, it's not. And you're going to find that on your scopes, you start looking at them. So when you're testing that parallax, if you see that scope will black out on you, in other words, you can't see through it with just a minimal amount of head movement, you've got a very small eyebox and a small shaft of light that comes out of the back of that scope that allows you to use the scope. So that'll tell you parallax. But this is about cheap scopes, so we've kind of gotten off on a tangent. Cheap scopes over scoping rimfires is something I love to do. I want to see at least 10, 12 power on a rimfire that I'm going to be shooting, because it's just, you can zoom right in. It makes for more enjoyable shooting for me. It's something that I really enjoy and I've done for a long time. And in order to afford doing it, you do it with a cheap scope. And a cheap scope works out fine on these rimfires. Generally speaking, when you're buying a more expensive scope, you're buying you're buying those extra few minutes in the morning for hunting and those last few minutes at night. The more you spend, the more you invest in your optic, the better glass, the better clarity, the better coatings that you're getting give you the ability to collect more light, see earlier, and see later. Sometimes it doesn't make a difference because we have laws in place for our hunting that says you can't hunt before the sun's up. So it's not as big a deal for us here in the United States. In Europe and in other parts of the world where hunting isn't as regulated, or you can hunt in nighttime, big objectives, really clear special coatings are really an important thing, because you're allowed to hunt when there's very little light, and you need as much light gathered by that scope, you know, collected, gathered, able to be transmitted through, than you do here in the United States, where we have laws on, most states, laws on hunting after hours, late at night, where there's little or no light. So a cheaper scope on a 22 is generally something that's a fun gun. It's something you're going to be using. You don't need to worry about that first minutes of sunlight or the last few minutes of daylight. You can get away with a cheaper scope that may not collect as much light, may not afford you that extra 15, 20 minutes, half an hour in the morning, you know, or the same at night, extra 15, 20, 35 minutes at the end of the day. And you're saving money. The way the scope works inside, the repeatability, is a killer on these cheaper scopes. But if you're not going to be screwing on the turrets, you set them and forget them, these can be just as good as the, you know, scopes 3, 4, 5 times as much money as far as their ability to hold zero. Just as good. Where they fall down is the quality of the glass, the ability to transmit light, and things like that, the durability of construction. That's what you're paying for with those big optics. But on a rimfire, you can get away with this cheap stuff, and that's where I like to put them. So this, like I said, this one has been around. This scope for me has been on half a dozen different rifles, and this is where it lives now, partially because it fits so good. I'd like to have a better scope on it, because this is a really nice rifle. This is a really pretty walnut stocked, fancy, high grade, high end Savage bolt action rifle, and it shoots really good. But it shoots really good with this scope, so I'm happy with it. That's just a Tasco, and a Tasco, I'm going to throw it in with the cheaper Bushnells and with the Simmons. Here's a Simmons Master Series. This one here, let's see if we can get this without being blurry. This is a Pro Hunter 4-12 side focus. And this one over here is a Pro Sport 4-12 adjustable objective. So this one is the same as this one over here, and this one here is a side focus. So can we pop it out here quick? I think we can. Pop it out here real quick, and we'll show you what I mean by side focus. If you haven't seen them, basically it's got a turret on the side. Lets you focus this from 25 yards to infinity on the side instead of out here on the objective. That's it. That's the difference. And this is probably a little more expensive than a cheap scope, but I know I didn't pay a lot for these. I bought them on sale. That's why I've got 2 of them. They were clearance. I bought them on sale, and they didn't get on guns. Those are the Simmons, and that's what I'm going to say is my favorite, the Simmons. And that 22 mag that a couple of guys have talked about is a dynamite scope for rimfires. And the last one I want to show you is the one that's on my heavy barrel, my precision long range 1022 build, which I've never done a video on. I really should. It's a really nice rifle. But what it's got on it is a cheap Bushnell. This is a Banner, I think. Where does it say it on these? Yeah, Banner, right here. Bushnell Banner, adjustable objective. And this is a 6-18, I believe. Yeah, 6-18 scope. And this has, although it doesn't have target turrets, they are finger adjustable, which is nice. Really nice. This is not an expensive scope. I don't know exactly what this model is, but most of these scopes were under $100. Most of the Banner line are right at $100 or under dollars. That to me is what I consider a budget scope. So there we go. My budget choice is going to be Simmons, and what I'm going to lump in with it is the Tascos and the Bushnells, and there's probably a couple other brands. Centerpoint comes to mind, is a good budget scope. Large power range, large zoom. Again, smallest for me would be like 2 to 10, and biggest, I mean, I've seen 8 to 32s. I used to run those for my Chevy Truck Challenge guns, just like this one, big honking scope on it. They get heavy, so be aware these big scopes can get heavy, but that can be a positive as well as a negative. You got a big heavy 920 barrel on here. This one happens to be 20 inches, so most of these, I'm sorry, 22 inches. This is a 22-inch barrel. Most of these are 20s, 18s or 20s. This one is a 22 920 barrel. I'm trying to think of who makes this. It's a big name, and I can't think of who it is. I don't think it says it on it. It does say it on it, but I can't read it. I'm reading backwards. 22 long rifle only. Green Mountain. Green Mountain barrel. That's who this one is. Good maker of these barrels. They got their name from black powder guns, but they make some really nice 1022 barrels too. All right, we're not talking about barrels, we're talking about scopes. So there's my boomstick challenge video on cheap budget scopes, as CW refers to them. God bless everybody. Remember those of us who can use your prayers. There's quite a few of us, and we're pretty needy in your prayers. And my wife is one, and Lakeview Outdoors' wife is another one, and our friend Julio Ocean is another one. And I know I'm forgetting a whole bunch more. I apologize, but those are the three that are in my thoughts these days. So please remember them. God bless everybody. CW out.